Welcome to another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast brought to you by Courtroom Sciences. I'm Dr. Steve Wood. Extremely excited and humbled about today's podcast. Today's guest is someone, as I was coming up through graduate school, her papers were required reading in graduate school when she was giving speeches. Everybody came to watch her speak. And that person is Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. Dr. Loftus is a distinguished professor of psychological science, criminology and law and society, cognitive science and law at the University of California-Irvine. So she's in each one of those departments. Professor Loftus is one of the nation's leading experts on memory. She's been an expert witness or consultant in hundreds of cases, including the McMartin preschool molestation case, the trial of Oliver North, the trial of the officers accused in the Rodney King beating, and the litigation involving Michael Jackson, Martha Stewart, Scooter Libby, and the Duke University lacrosse players. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. You are, from a psychological perspective, you've obviously been named one of the more influential psychologists of the 20th century. So getting you on the podcast to talk to you today is definitely a pleasure. And what I brought you on today was really to talk about the idea of memory. That's really where your expertise lies. Myself and my colleague, Ava Hernandez, wrote an article in Law 360 talking about memory and the whole idea of, I don't know and I don't recall, and we're going to get more into that. Really, what I just want to kind of do is take a step back and really just talk to you about how did you get involved in this area of memory? Because I know you've been doing it for several years. So how did you get your start in it?
So, well, I don't know how long the version you want, but how did I get into memory? I was studying, I was getting my Ph.D. in mathematical psychology at Stanford. And I don't know, I wasn't that excited about mathematical psychology. But I took a course from a social psychologist who was doing a study of memory. He asked me if I wanted to participate in this research project, and I started to work with him on semantic memory, which you, with your background in psychology, would know is memory for words and concepts, and knowing that Austin is a city in Texas, for example, is a piece of semantic memory. And so I worked on semantic memory for a while, and at some point thought, I really want to do work that has more obvious practical relevance. But what might that be? I knew something about the field of memory, but I always had a keen interest in legal matters and legal issues. How about studying the memory of witnesses to accidents and crimes and other legally relevant events? Eyewitness memory. And so that's what I started to do. It actually started after I left graduate school and was out there on my own, beginning my teaching career, that I started doing those studies of eyewitness memory.
Yeah, and I just want to talk in general. Can you just kind of give an overview to the audience about memory? What are the different stages of memory? As someone who, so say, for example, a witness who is involved in a case, as they are viewing an incident, kind of what's going on in that process of what they're seeing, how they're encoding it, and how they're ultimately storing it.
Well, as researchers, we sort of divide the process into three major stages. So first, there's an event that occurs. Let's say it's an accident, and a witness stores some bits of information about the experience. That's the encoding stage or the acquisition stage. But now time passes and memory starts to fade. And need a PhD or to be a memory scientist to know that memory weakens over time. What's a little less a matter of common sense is that during this next phase, which we call the retention phase, as the memory is fading, sometimes people can be exposed to some new information about the event. They overhear another witness discussing it, or they see media coverage about the event, or they just get some new information. And that new information can enter a person's memory and contaminate or distort or transform that memory. So now when you try to question people about their experience, you ask them questions, you ask them to retrieve information from their memory about the accident. What you sometimes get is a sort of mixture of bits of what they actually experienced and then bits of whatever else they may have learned or picked up at some later time. So that's a little bit about the stages of memory and a little bit about the malleable nature of memory.
And you've shown through a lot of your studies about how malleable memory is, right? Can you talk a little bit about some of your famous studies that you've done as it relates to stop signs, yield signs, and all of that?
Well, it was the stop sign yield sign study was one where we showed people an accident, simulated accident. Let's say a car goes through a yield sign. Later on, they get exposed to suggestive information that it was a stop sign. And finally, we're going to say, now, what kind of sign do you remember seeing controlling that intersection? And in this study, many people will succumb to the suggestion and claim that they saw the sign that was suggested to them afterwards. And so when people do that, they're exhibiting something called the misinformation effect. When people get misinformation about an event, it can be incorporated into their memory and contaminate their memory, and their memory is poorer. I'll tell you, in that original stop sign yield sign study we did, of course, we got people, some actually saw a yield sign and we suggested stop, and others it was the reverse. Everything was counterbalanced just the way a good experiment would do. But the way we introduced the misinformation into memory is kind of interesting. So let's say I showed you an accident where the car went through a yield sign. We then ask a question like, did another car pass the little red Datsun when it was there at the intersection with the stop sign? You think that's a question about whether another car passed, and you're concentrating on that part of the question, trying to answer. But I slip in the information that it was a stop sign. It kind of invades people, sort of like a Trojan horse, because they don't even detect that it's coming. And later on, well, tell me what sign you remember seeing at the intersection, and many people will say stop sign. So, that's just one example of hundreds and hundreds of studies showing the power of post-event suggestion to contaminate memory.
And I think you've done some other research too, and it's not even, and then maybe this goes back to your initial research on semantics about how just changing one word or one clause in the sentence is enough to alter someone's memory too, as well, right?
Well, that too is a kind of misinformation study. And what we did in the work in that work on it was a project on leading questions. So we showed people simulated accidents. Some of our witnesses are asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Others are asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And not only did we find that if we asked the smash question, people remembered a higher estimate of speed. They told us the cars were going faster. But when we came back to them a week later and asked these witnesses more questions, including, did you see any broken glass? People for whom we had used the smash question were more likely to tell us they saw broken glass when there wasn't any broken glass at all. And so what that study taught us is that a leading question can affect not just the immediate answer, but can really influence a witness's memory and affect what they say and think and remember and report, often much, much later.
And I always find that interesting because I actually use that example from your research when I work with witnesses, just talking about the subtle change in words when we talk about car accident versus car crash, and how a witness's brain misses those two changes in words, but then they end up agreeing to the car crash versus the car accident. And now essentially you've adopted the terminology of opposing counsel that it was a car crash, which, to your point, right, makes you think of twisted metal, smoke, broken glass a lot different than just a car accident, fender bender. So I always thought that was interesting about how just a change in one word can really change the perceptions.
Yes, absolutely.
And I guess the question on leading questions too, as far as that from a legal perspective, maybe I guess there's some nefarious uses to it, but do sometimes people just accidentally use these different words and change people's memories? I mean, is it some things that sometimes it just happens by accident, or is it necessarily always on purpose?
Oh no, I think sometimes people do things on purpose, and sometimes they do things unwittingly. And I tend to be a little bit more generous in attributing motives to people that they may not realize what they're doing. But you're sort of reminding me of something when I used to lecture about these studies and how different words could affect the way people remembered an event. Sometimes law students after a lecture would come up to me and they'd say, should you be lecturing about all this? Aren't you training people to be able to deliberately contaminate the minds of witnesses? However, when I would lecture to practicing lawyers at continuing education events or at law, at some other professional situation, the lawyers would sometimes come up and say, "Is there some catalog of which words work the best and that you could refer us to?" So. And I have raised in some of my lectures, this ethical question of when you're interviewing someone and it's in your interest, your client's interest, to have the witness remember the speed as being as high as possible, is it ethical to say how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? When it's likely to increase the speed in their minds. I mean, and it's not for me to answer. This is for somebody else to decide, what is and isn't ethical. But I can just tell you, how the mind works.
And I think that's that's where you've gotten some pushback from what I understand. And we're going to talk a little bit more on probably the second part about repressed memories. But that's where you've gotten some pushback too, right? Is they are out there essentially giving you grief and accusing you of helping people to manipulate individuals, and you're more or less saying, I'm not doing that. I'm just the researcher. I'm just telling you how it is, and I'm not necessarily advocating one way or the other. It's just me giving you information.
Right. When I am consulting in a case, I'm like investigating whether there's any evidence that this kind of thing happened in this particular case. And as you know, most of the time you don't have a recording of what happened. And of course you do in the courtroom, but by then the witnesses' memories are usually rehearsed and somewhat solidified, and everybody is listening to the kinds of questions that people are asking. That doesn't mean you can't affect the jury, though. That is constructing an event that they never witnessed, but trying to construct and imagine what might have happened as they then make their decisions.
When you talk about constructing and coming up with the retrieval and the encoding and that, there's some disagreements in the field about whether or not emotion helps memory or it hinders memory. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of debate on that, and then where from your research where you've kind of fallen on how stress influences the memory?
Well, that's a hard question to answer in just a few minutes, because there's so many kind of different opinions and different kinds of studies that have been done. But I still kind of believe in the Yerkes-Dodson law. If you remember that from your grad school days, that when you have very, very low emotion, low arousal, low stress, like when you're waking up in the morning, your cognitive functioning and memory is not that great. But if you have extremely high emotion and stress and arousal, your cognitive functioning isn't that great. There's sort of a middle area, and that's why you have this upside down U curve, this middle area where you're performing cognitively a little better than at either of the extremes. But if you do a study, and you might find that higher emotion sometimes hurts memory, you might find higher emotion sometimes helps memory. And it sort of completely depends on what side of that curve you're on, whether you're going to be going up or going down. But I can tell you that, for example, in one of the studies, one of my favorite studies, which is a collaboration with, a psychiatrist named Morgan, who had access to soldiers who were going to survival school and learning what it's going to be like for them if they're ever captured as prisoners of war. In studies that we did together, you do find that, first of all, the really high stress condition is associated with very poor memory, and that these soldiers are quite susceptible to post-event contamination.
And it's interesting. Is there any sort of, we talk about in kind of one of the crux of the paper we wrote was how some people will say, I don't know, I don't recall. And some jurors will say that makes total sense. It's been 4 years. They shouldn't be expected to know. And then you have another subset of people who say, how can you not remember something like that? This should have been so traumatic of an event. It should have been burned in your memory. Is there some sort of like personality characteristics, or like what have you found as the people who just have different opinions on how memory and stress should be affected?
Well, I'd have to go back, and there've been a whole lot of studies on what lay people in general think is true about memory. Collectively, these studies show that many people, and these are people who end up serving on juries, have misconceptions about the workings of memory. They think things are true about memory that are unsupported by the scientific literature, or even contradicted by the scientific literature. But getting back to the part of your question where people are saying, I don't remember, it has surprised me sometimes that people get nailed for saying, I don't remember, that the people assume that they must be deliberately lying. Of course you remember. And if you say, I don't remember, that you're just lying to protect yourself. But people have been convicted because they said, I don't remember. You just have to look to Martha Stewart, who claimed that she didn't remember that her broker, her stockbroker, told her that the president of the company was selling the particular stock of interest. Anyhow, that was just one case where I was kind of surprised that she got nailed for saying, I don't remember.
Yeah, I mean, and you think, like I said, it's perilous, because a lot of times I've heard attorneys tell their witnesses it's okay if you don't remember, because the last thing you want to do is speculate, right? I think it goes back to something I've seen in some of your writings where you talk about the I think I believe is what people use when they're talking about imagined memories. So this kind of hedging, or when they start using I think I believe, makes it sound like they're not 100% confident in what they're saying.
Yeah, and that's what people, that hedging, that verbal hedging is associated with a perception of lack of confidence. But in a way, it's the more cautious thing to be doing.
In a deposition, you'd want to be more cautious, right? Rather than trying to speculate and say something that's not actually true just because you want to have an answer. The problem is, like you said, you run the risk of the jurors thinking you're saying, I don't know, or I don't recall, just to protect yourself.
Right.
And I guess the question is, do you get involved in cases? I know you get involved in like criminal cases, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And you've been involved in civil cases, but do you get involved much in cases as it relates to just educating jurors on this whole idea of I don't recall, I don't know, so that when people are hearing that, they're more have like an expert witness who is telling them, okay, it makes sense that they shouldn't. So we misunderstand the way the brain works. So when they say, I don't know, I don't recall, that's actually truthful versus them thinking that they should have known the answer.
In most of the cases that I've been involved in, the memory issue is a little different than that. In most of the cases, somebody is remembering something or claiming that they remember something that's in dispute. So, if a plaintiff is remembering some very specific episode, and the defense is denying that it happened or denying that it happened in that way, then the defense might look to a memory expert to talk about, how could somebody be saying something with such confidence and detail and even emotion if it didn't happen? And what we know from being involved in this scientific field is that false memories can have those same characteristics. People can be very detailed and confident and even emotional about their memories when they're false. So that's the more typical kind of situation where I have found myself enmeshed in actual cases. There are a few situations where it is the issue you're raising here of somebody claiming they didn't see something or they didn't remember something. Martha Stewart is one example. I actually consulted on that case. I actually went to New York and I met Martha in her lawyer's office and had a chance to interview her about the conversation that she had with her stockbroker, where she claimed that that what he had told her was fact A, fact B, fact C. And when she had been interviewed by the investigators and asked, did he tell you that the president of the company was selling? She said, I don't remember anything about that. So when I interviewed her, I wanted to know the setting. Where was she when she had this conversation? Maybe there's some good psychological reason why she didn't remember this one detail that they thought was so important. She told me that it was Christmas time and she and her girlfriend, I think she was recently divorced or something, had taken a plane. They were going to go on a little trip to Mexico or something. They were refueling in some city in Texas, like San Antonio or somewhere. And on the tarmac is where she had the conversation. So I wanted to know a lot about the noise, and maybe she didn't hear the whole conversation. And then I asked her, what were you doing just before you had this conversation? Well, we would have been on the plane. I said, doing what? Well, we were having lunch. I said, what'd you have for lunch? She said, we had, I believe she said, smoked salmon, caviar, and vodka. I said, vodka? How much vodka? Well, a couple of drinks. So I know that people often underestimate their drinks. I said, well, maybe it was the vodka, because even two or three drinks is enough to negatively affect the formation of new memories. And unless there's some reason you don't want to mention that you were drinking vodka on the plane, she said, no, I don't care. And this would have been the vodka defense would have happened, except for the fact that during the trial, the defense thought things were going so well, they cut short the defense and called hardly any witnesses. And sadly for her, she was convicted. But so there's an example of somebody who said she didn't remember something. There is an explanation for why the whole conversation might not have been remembered, but it never made it to the jury.
The vodka defense. That's good. And I think that's always interesting. It sounds like too, though, you're saying how she could remember all those things, the smoked salmon and all where she was at and what she was doing. But then there's one piece they can't remember. I think that also plays into how people then say, you remember all these other things, but you don't remember this. So it must be convenient.
Well, and potentially that could have happened. And then who knows what she would have said. Maybe she would have said, I always had the same meal on this plane. That was my favorite. Yeah. Just like I order my everything bagel and my cup of coffee at Panera's every time I go there. So Who knows?
Yeah. Well, that's
We're
another
all
thing too.
speculating at this point.
Right.
So,
Exactly. Which we tell witnesses not to do.
well, Steve, I've got another kind of a cool example.
Yeah.
Again, you're triggering sort of memories of some older cases, but I did once testify on behalf of a police officer. This was during a potential termination of his job because he had failed to mention anything about a fight that he should have noticed and just didn't mention it in a report. Then he got accused of deliberately omitting it and so on. So why? He said, I really didn't notice it. I was paying attention somewhere else. And we ended up, do you know the gorilla video where that we ended up showing this trier of fact, the gorilla video, saying, look, if you're concentrating elsewhere, you can even miss a big, large black gorilla, walking across a basketball court. That's what the distribution of attention is all about. So it's just another example of somebody who got in trouble for saying he didn't notice, he didn't remember anything about a fight. And there may have been a very good reason for that.
Yeah, I think that, and like you said, that makes me think some other things too, that, as far as from my work and just from research and stuff that I've read, like this whole kind of idea of weapon focus too, right? When they talk about when assaults happen or something, that everybody's so focused on the weapon and they miss a lot of the other information, that's the peripheral information, because they're so distracted by it. And then when you go to ask them, all they can do is focus on what the weapon was, and they can't remember the other things. And everybody thinks, how can that happen? That's just another one of those, I think, points like you're talking about how we think everybody takes in all the information as they're watching it. But really, a lot of times, if you and I were to see the exact same incident, probably you would look at one thing, I would look at another. And when we came back, you would have a different recollection than what I had.
Absolutely. And could you remember your weapon focus?
Yeah. Hey, I was a good student.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually it brings up one of the things, one of your books, Witness for the Defense, I've read, and I think it's great. And in there, he says, the witnesses are not liars. What we think we know is not necessarily the truth. So I think that's interesting. Can you talk a little bit about when people are misremembering things, are they doing it on purpose or not necessarily?
No, in these misinformation studies, people are, I believe, they honestly believe in what they're saying. And I often do get asked, well, how do you know they really think they saw a stop sign when they tell you they did? Maybe they're just saying it because they think it's what you want to hear. And that, of course, is the problem of demand characteristics in a study. And we do think about how can we rule out or how can we disentangle and learn whether people really believe in what they're saying. And there are a couple of different ways that psychologists have figured out how to investigate this. And one is, is the witness willing to tell some totally different person who comes along a little later and asks them some questions? And we'll often see, they continue to insist on this memory, even though they're talking to some totally different person at a totally different time as part of what they think is a totally different experiment. That convinces us that we have really contaminated their memory and they're not deliberately lying.
That's interesting too, because you mentioned a little bit before that the idea really of confidence, detail, and emotion doesn't always equate to accuracy. Some people get very confident in what they saw. They get very emotional about what they saw, but just because you're confident and emotional doesn't necessarily mean what you saw was accurate. But I think it goes probably to your point, is in their mind, it is accurate. So they're not necessarily giving incorrect testimony or incorrect recollection of it. It's just in their mind, it's accurate.
Right.
Very interesting. That's why you've kept yourself busy for so many years. And I want to ask one more question, and then we're going to wrap up on this portion. But I guess the question for attorneys is, if you're preparing witnesses, should they be giving them information if they say, I don't know, I don't recall? And in your meetings with the witness, is it better to provide documents to them to help them so they can eliminate the I don't know and I don't recalls? Or is it potentially opening up the possibility to contamination of their memory now that they believe that they know more than they really do, or they saw it differently?
I'm listening to a question that I don't think I've ever been asked in that way before, and I can only say that I would imagine that this, you got to take this on a case by case basis. That there is no one right answer to that question. That that maybe having a witness occasionally say I don't know or I don't remember makes the whole package of testimony look less rehearsed, and you don't want to eliminate that altogether. But I think it's going to depend on what the facts are that are most pertinent, and what your theory of the case is.
I think that's exactly kind of where I landed too, is each situation is going to be different. But I guess the biggest thing is what I didn't want any attorneys to take away from this is like, okay, now we need to always give all this information to our witnesses. They can't say, I don't know, I don't recall. They need to start speculating, because we can't have, I don't know, I don't recall responses. And I think the biggest point is I wanted to get across too, is I think sometimes I don't know, I don't recall, when factually correct, is a truthful, honest, accurate answer. And that's the better answer than trying to speculate.
Right. And it doesn't have to be harmful, even if it was harmful for Martha Stewart and for the police officer who had to be defended to keep his job.
Well, Dr. Loftus, I appreciate it. This will be the end of part one, but I'm going to have you back on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about a lot of your work with repressed memories. This has been another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast. Go to our website, courtroomsciences.com. All of our blogs, posts, articles are up there. We'll see you in the next part with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus as we talk about repressed memories.